All right. Hello, everyone. I am Bailee, a professional development assistant at the American Public Gardens Association. And thank you so much for joining us today. And now I will hand it over to Trey Ramsey to begin introductions.
Thank you so much, Bailee. So welcome everyone to this Idea Cafe on transgender inclusion in public gardens. I'm really excited to be part of this panel today because it's a topic that has not really been addressed enough in public gardens and more broadly. So my name is Trey Ramsey, they, them pronouns. I am on the American Public Gardens Association's IDEA Committee, and I am a horticulturist at Cornell University. I recently completed my master's with a concentration in public garden leadership at Cornell University, where I did a project on LGBTQ inclusion in public gardens after seeing the relative lack of resources that gardens currently have. And that's me, and now the other panelists can introduce themselves.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Valuch. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm actually a student, so I'm a senior studying horticulture over at UW-Madison, so I'm over in the Midwest. My focus is kind of on public horticulture, and just my most recent affiliation, I was the Horticulture Apprentice at the Allen Centennial Garden here on UW's campus.
Hey there, I'm Kane. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the manager of corporate and foundation relations at Tower Hill Botanic Garden in Central Massachusetts, as well as the co-chair of our staff inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility committee. I'm also the founding co-chair of the LGBTQ Museum Staff and Students Social Networking Group, which is an affinity group of the New England Museum Association.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So we are going to get started by talking about our experiences in horticulture, public gardens with transgender inclusion. So as I mentioned, I recently completed my master's program where I looked pretty closely at, excuse me one second. I apologize for that. I recently completed my project on LGBTQ inclusion in public gardens. And I found that while some gardens have been making good progress on LGBTQ inclusion, things are moving, more slowly than they are in some areas, particularly for transgender inclusion. As a whole, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer inclusion is decent at public gardens compared to some other fields, particularly for white gay men. But for trans folks and for people of color, things are behind. And so I really wanted to create something that would help people further inclusion. And so I made my toolkit.
So my experiences are definitely a little more on the brief side. So my time at Allen Centennial Garden was actually the first internship or job I had where like in public horticulture, where I was kind of openly identifying as trans and non-binary and being willing to open dialogue about that. So yeah, it was definitely a lot different than my first internship. Especially there was a lot more interaction with people. I also, to my knowledge, I was the first trans employee to be hired at Allen Centennial Garden. So there was definitely a lot of like education that I was taking on myself because a lot of the people around me, because they are cisgender, didn't really have the education or the tools to do so. So there were definitely a lot of experiences where I was educating people, and because of that, there were definitely some experiences I've had with microaggression and tokenization, and there were definitely a lot of good things that I've experienced as well, which I'll definitely talk about and touch on later in the panel. Yeah, it was definitely interesting, and I think I've learned a lot about how I want to see trans inclusion for myself and other people in the future, and kind of how I want to impart that to other people, which is what we're here to talk about.
So my experience at Tower Hill as a cisgender queer person has actually been quite positive, and that certainly has to do with, as been mentioned before, my position as a white individual as well as a cis individual. So we actually just celebrated our second annual Pride celebration in the garden. It rained, so unfortunately there were only about 150 people, but it was a free event. It was just a fantastic opportunity for folks to gather and celebrate the LGBTQ community. And how that really began was about 4 years ago. I was the executive assistant, and personally, I wanted to get more involved in our local Pride celebrations in the neighboring city of Worcester. So I had the opportunity to bring up at a senior leadership meeting what would be the opportunity for us to get involved in Pride. And it was incredible. Immediately, everyone said yes. And then our CFOO said, yes, and can we have a flag raising? And so it went, because we had a core group of senior leaders who were so inclusive, they knew me, and I was willing to step forward and sort of be the catalyst to start this change, that they were really excited about this. But it was a lot of, at the beginning, was a lot of symbolic, which is still important, but symbolic action. So marching in our Pride Parade and doing a flag raising and being at the, actually at the festival. And I had a colleague who had recently graduated undergrad who reached out to me and said, you know, we did what they had been calling at the time an inclusive language workshop. And they really thought that it would be important for Tower Hill to do that. And they were another cisgender queer person like myself, but understood that it was important for us to start having these dialogues. So we actually came together to have our first LGBTQ inclusion training, which walks through breaking down the acronym of LGBTQ, talking about the ideas of gender identity versus gender expression, and really starting to have those initial conversations. And simultaneously, it happened that two of our first trans staff members, at least I should say openly trans staff members, joined the staff later on that fall. And that meant that we had already started having these conversations, and that they didn't have to be the folks advocating for themselves initially. That myself and my colleague Trisha had sort of already outed ourselves as allies to be able to help and support folks in making sure that the two individuals who were onboarded felt comfortable. And it's led to a myriad of great things. For example, pronouns are now encouraged in our name tags and in our signatures. We had 2 single stall bathrooms down in the basement that we just updated to gender neutral bathrooms, and continue to repeat LGBTQ inclusion workshops, which is just incredible. And I could talk forever, and we're totally going to do that. So Trey and Al, based on your experiences, what are sort of the most long-lasting positive changes that you've played a role in that you're really, really proud of, that are staying the course?
Yeah, so something that I wanted to mention before that I neglected to was, so now you've heard a little bit about all of us, and I just wanted to point out who is not necessarily in the room right now. We are a bunch of white, non-Indigenous folks, trans and cis, who are, speaking to you today. And I want to make sure everyone understands that some of the folks who face some of the largest challenges in the transgender community are trans people of color, particularly Black and Latina trans women. And so it's really important that if we really want to have trans justice, we need to address the intersections of racism, of economic oppression, and of misogyny. And so we're going to speak about some of the specific issues for trans folks, but that this is a much larger discussion that goes with all sorts of IDEA principles. But with that, some of the positive things that I have done and observed are, so from what I've seen in my project and in my own work, as I said before, gardens are often at a pretty early place in terms of LGBTQ inclusion and are more behind in trans inclusion. But when I was working with Cornell Botanic Gardens, we were able to put on some of the garden's first LGBTQ focused programming. Unfortunately, it was during the pandemic, so we were going to have some in-person tours and programs and ended up having to do them online, but it was great to be able to do that and to partner with the local LGBT Resource Center on campus in order to actually have more voices from the community being able to participate and bring people in. I'll also say that I have seen, a few years ago, I visited a garden that was just starting its IDEA journey, just starting to look at diversity and inclusion. They had some stumbling blocks along the way, as we all do. Yet just this past year, they were putting on workshops for IDEA principles, and they specifically included transgender inclusion topics. And so that was amazing to hear. And so I'm really encouraged at the ways that gardens are advancing and are looking at these topics.
Okay, so because my time at Allen Centennial Garden was pretty short, since I'm a horticulture apprentice, my full-time working at Allen Centennial Garden was pretty strictly limited to the summer. And because I was really the first openly trans person on staff, there was definitely a very limited range of things I could accomplish, especially on my own. But it was for me, it was a journey of sort of seeing where, as a garden, where our strengths and weaknesses lie in terms of where our representation and acceptance could use help and where it's already pretty strong, and just kind of working with that. I'm definitely not the first queer member of our staff, but I think I was kind of the catalyst that really got us talking about it, especially in terms of public representation. So representation pushing outward past garden staff and outward to the public and to our volunteers and things like that. And well, it did unfortunately kind of come from a result of me facing some serious misgendering and microaggression at the hands of somebody that was a trusted member of our garden, that kind of served as a launching pad for thinking more in depth about this. So I was kind of able to talk with our volunteers and our volunteer board and my bosses and kind of come up with some future plans as far as really implementing some sensitivity and understanding at Allen Centennial Garden for trans and queer identities, and just kind of opening that dialogue and getting a conversation going. So right now I know I'm also the student representative for the board of the Friends of Allen Centennial Garden, who runs a lot of the volunteer side of things. And right now, I've kind of talked with the chair of that board a little bit, and there's talk of having some pronoun workshops and workshops just dealing with sensitivity and education and acceptance in terms of broad LGBTQ plus inclusion and acceptance, but specifically in terms of accepting and understanding and being sensitive to the gender identities of anybody that happens to come into the garden, especially as our volunteers tend to be in the more retired age range. So a lot of this stuff is new for a lot of these people. So as I recognized that at my time in the garden, one of the ways I decided to open a dialogue is to give further context, we give all of the interns give a sort of plant walk every week. So we would choose somewhere between like 3 and 8 plants, and we'd walk around our garden with our volunteers and whoever else wanted to join, and just educate people on plants. And during Pride Month, what I chose to do was to kind of do a plant walk about plants that are culturally and historically significant to the LGBTQ plus community. And 2 of those plants actually had to do with the trans experience specifically, which are roses and pansies. And so I talked about some of the struggles we face and tied that into talking about horticulture. And it served as a great avenue to open up a dialogue with these people, because we're all very passionate about the garden and about the plants that live in the garden. And I know all of these volunteers and other people at the garden has made it very clear how much they care about me and how much they want to learn about me as a person, including my gender identity. So it ended up being a really big success. I had a lot of people actually making the effort and trying to use my pronouns because I opened that dialogue and said, hey, I know it's really scary to start making that effort because you're afraid of making a mistake. Even as a trans person, way back in the day, I had to practice using other people's pronouns and kind of breaking down the assumptions my mind was trained to make in terms of the gender binary in our society. So we all start somewhere, and I just wanted to really encourage all of our volunteers and anybody that came into the garden that it's okay to make mistakes along the way, as long as you are correcting them with grace and understanding and with genuine intentions. And yeah, I saw great improvement of people using my pronouns after that. It was really amazing to be able to talk to people and educate them about my experience as a trans person through plants and through horticulture. It was really amazing. So really, I guess my biggest positive change was like just really cracking this egg and getting the conversation started at all at Allen Centennial Garden, because it was something we really haven't touched on yet.
I absolutely love that story, Al. And I have done a few workshops highlighting the connection of plants to the LGBTQ plus experience. And I think you're right. It just adds this personal touch. It connects us all as a community, the queer family as a community, and as well as into the horticultural space. So, and you started off by saying, oh, I was only there a little bit of a short time. But I always say, we can't do diversity and inclusion work without making a bunch of small steps and a few giant leaps. And I really think that, what you've just explained is exactly what you did. Is in a short amount of time, you were able to do what you could and are bringing Allen Centennial to me making these giant leaps. For me, I really think that it is about encouraging people to have those conversations is something that was really important to me, and that people knew that they could come to me because they wanted to be a better manager, and knowing, how do I say this? I knew that I could play a role of being an ally in having a conversation, but also I think it's important to recognize that if somebody was coming up to me and saying, hey, I'm not quite, this happened to me. I'm not quite sure of the gender and the pronouns of this interviewee. How should I approach this? That I can provide my insight as an ally and as having trans friends, and that's the experience that I'm coming from. But knowing that it is about making authentic connections with trans folks, making you share your experience, which is exactly what you did. And it's that is just so highly important in all diversity and inclusion work. But knowing that, it can be tough enough being a new person, whether it's as a student intern or a full-time staff member. And if you're the only, out trans person, or the only person who uses they, them pronouns, or, one of the few people who's visibly queer, can be really difficult. And so for me, it's really important that I'm encouraging folks to have those conversations and have conversations among each other as a staff. And then I can also be the first person who is going to introduce myself with my pronouns to that new staff member and know that they're that we're all part of the same family, while we don't have the identical experiences, that they have someone here who's who understands if there's something they need. And on that note, what are some of the challenges across the board that you folks see that our attendees should be aware of as they're going back into their days?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So in my research and observation, I've seen that gardens often have challenges knowing where and how to get started on idea work in general, but including on transgender and LGBTQ inclusion. And so I think, of course, the answer to that is twofold. One is that you just have to get started. And then the other part is that it's really good to look towards transgender community members, members of your garden staff, volunteers, and then look towards the local community outside of the garden if you would like more help and perspective. Another challenge that I've heard from many different gardens is getting the board and leadership, but in particular the board, to really care about idea issues. And one example of a garden that's been doing really well is the Denver Botanic Gardens, which some years ago really committed to getting its board to care about idea, to really give time and leadership to the people who really care about this. And so it's certainly a challenge. Money is a concern, and then just setting the direction for the garden. But it's one that a lot of folks have. And the final challenge that I've really seen is being able to just devote resources to idea work, especially for smaller gardens. As I mentioned, I'd worked with Cornell Botanic Gardens, which is a small university garden, and they have been, figuring out, how to devote staff time and energy to idea work, but they have committed to putting idea in their mission, in their values. Therefore, while they've been trying to figure out how to do some of the more specific work among staff, they're at least prioritizing their work, working with, for example, the local Indigenous community, the Haudenosaunee, to bring that to the Cornell community and the local Ithaca community. So many different challenges, but many different ways to work through them.
Yeah, honestly, I think Trey covered things really well, and what they were saying about, I think one of the biggest challenges really is just figuring out where to start. I think, especially in my experience at Allen Centennial Garden, we're like a 2-acre garden. I think we have like 3 like full-time permanent staff members. So it's really hard to find the time and resources between all 3 of these people to get things like that started, because a lot of the rest of the work at the garden is done through volunteers. So just getting our friends board and those volunteers on board with that kind of thing can definitely be a challenge for sure. And I think too, one of the bigger challenges is kind of getting people to understand that LGBTQ plus representation isn't like a blanket statement. So when you're talking about trans inclusion, that kind of has to be done not separately, but it has to be a different priority than just general queer representation. So as great as it is to maybe have a board for LGBTQ plus representation, if it's all run by if all of it's run by cisgender queer people, it's just not going to be helpful for trans people. As educated as some of these people may be on the trans experience, we as trans people are the trans experience. We are the primary sources for the trans experience. We have lived the trans experience. And horticulture, that's, if we're going to work on trans inclusion, our being here is going to be the most valuable for stepping in that direction. So not using LGBTQ plus representation as sort of a blanket statement, because you are going to be missing a lot of different identities if you just resort to one queer person for all LGBTQ plus issues. You'll be missing, for example, the trans experience or the intersex experience or the experience of somebody who is two-spirit, like Indigenous. So I think that's another really big challenge, is sort of breaking the mold and the standard idea of what a lot of outside people have as far as ideas about what the LGBTQIA plus community is, and that we are so much broader and richer, and we're all so vastly different from one another that, we're not a blanket statement, and we need a lot more representation than just one queer person, because things are so different for each and every one of us.
Absolutely. Our board had several openly gay members, including our board president. He helped me raise the pride flag and we were all crying. We had several senior staff members who were openly queer, and that really normalized the idea of being gay or lesbian. But when we started having conversations about putting pronouns in signatures, all of a sudden it said, well, the board felt that this was a political statement. And it takes a couple of steps. Well, how come we were okay with our board president having this moving speech about, being a young gay man, but putting pronouns is a political statement? And I think a public garden colleague pointed out, a lot of these things are just common sense. And these are human changes that we need to make as humans for people to feel welcomed and understood. There's nothing political about it. It's simply humanity. And so to overcome some of those challenges, I will say I was the rebel who just started throwing my pronouns in my signature. And I started doing that because I saw that the Massachusetts Cultural Council had done it, who is one of our largest funders. And so I again, using my white cis privilege, knew I was able to say, our biggest funder is doing this. We need to do that. And that actually did resonate with our board and anybody who was on the fence. And I think it's also important that for us, it's no one has to do it, because I do think when you put your pronouns in your signature, you are opening up yourself to be asked some questions. And if someone's not comfortable being asked those questions, they shouldn't be felt that they're put on that spot. But I'd say 90% of our organization has decided to do it. It is probably the only option in your signature. Everything else is pretty standardized. I think another thing that is really important is people still need to work on not making assumptions about people as soon as they like walk up to the desk or walk into a meeting or something like this. And I do it all of the time. You know, for 30 years of my life, I've been told, you know, to say things like ma'am or sir, or is that your wife, or where's your mom, or things like that. And those can be really difficult. And so working on really internalizing gender neutral language, because then you're inclusive of people of all genders, of all experiences, of all relationships, but also recognizing that being trans is not a point of gossip. It was really hurtful when I heard that a staff member had overheard volunteers saying, oh, what's his true gender? Or is he really a boy? And that's really hurtful. It doesn't matter, you know, and this individual was actually put on the spot of like, oh, so he's really a boy? And it's just, well, you know, he uses he, him pronouns, and that's what I know. Like, that's the answer to the question. And so I think that's something that, even though like we all may say like, oh, that's never a conversation I'd have in public, but are you also, I catch myself in my mind of saying, does it matter whether that person is a transgender individual? No. And just really trying to make the next levels to make those thoughts not even enter your brain. And that is the same conditioning that has taken us decades and decades to get to where we are. To now uncondition those decades and decades is really difficult. And so for me, I'm always encouraging folks to consume media that is by trans people, that has trans characters, so that you know, even if you don't necessarily have a colleague or a friend who's trans, that person becomes the person who's helping you understand the experience, normalize the experience. Also explaining, like, you know, Al, you just experienced, you very eloquently shared your experience. Not all 118 of us are, you know, there's many more people than that. Who are some other people that we can surround ourselves with to really understand the trans experience and just make it be part of that common sense, that humanity. Yeah. Hey, Al.
Yeah, I also wanted to touch on something you said in that whole, that's not a conversation I would have in public. And I think, what a statement to make. I think that's something that's really important to talk about in terms of the transgender experience, because if you as a cis person are going to say, you know, well, this isn't a conversation I would have in public, or this isn't something I would say to their face, something in that statement tells me, and it says that you in your head know that something about saying this is wrong, to the point where you wouldn't do it publicly. You wouldn't ask this person to their face, oh, well, you know, like, what's your assigned gender at birth? Like, what were you born with? Like, what's your birth name? Like, if you wouldn't ask that to a trans person's face, or if you wouldn't have that kind of conversation in public, there's probably a reason for that. And I think doing the unpacking and thinking about, you know, why wouldn't I say this in front of somebody else? Oh, it's because it's actually not an okay thing to do, whether it's publicly or privately. And I should examine why I feel the need to have these kinds of conversations, and why I feel the need to examine other people's genders when it's really none of my business.
100%, absolutely. And I really appreciate you highlight of you bringing home that point, Al. an end of sentence. We all, as cis allies who are on the call, need to be better at that, 150%. In addition to, I'd say, number one, unpacking, decades of that, of those stereotypes and that sort of thought process. Trey and Al, what are some specific changes that are really meaningful for you for trans inclusion in public gardens specifically, or in the world more broadly?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you both for sharing those experiences. So kind of drawing off of those experiences about, unpacking, your own assumptions and everything, I very much think that trans inclusion needs to be part of a cultural change in your organization and more broadly in our culture. Than it can't just be, these one-off policies, or you can't just put pronouns in your email signatures and then that's that. You actually have to kind of institutionalize and really have a cultural shift of understanding, of not making assumptions about folks, of not assuming genders, of using gender neutral language when you are talking about someone non-specific, or if you don't know someone's gender. So I think that's really where things need to start, by attempting to make this cultural shift, which takes a long time and there will be stumbles, but it's absolutely vital. And then beyond that, it is really important to, when you're talking about idea work, when you're talking about diversity and inclusion, and when you're spelling out certain identities, certain things that are protected within your organization, to spell out trans inclusion. So if you have a non-discrimination statement, make sure that trans identities, that gender identity expression are included. When you are doing training on idea principles, make sure that you include things about trans experience, and if you have the time, have specific trainings. And then really important for any aspect of idea work, and certainly no less for trans inclusion, is making sure you're working with, and if possible, having these efforts led by trans folks who are interested in doing the work. So like I said before, whether that's someone on your staff, whether it's a volunteer, whether it's the people in the local community, reach out and support the people who really want to do this work. And if at all possible, get diverse experiences. Don't just rely on one person, but try to have as many people as possible, and try to see if you can kind of make it not just the same types of faces that you normally see, white, etc. And yeah, so those are some of the biggest things. Al?
Yeah, so one of the things I guess I'll start off with is there's a lot of talk, I'm sure a lot of you have heard a lot of talk about bathrooms lately. And I think one, having bathrooms on facility at gardens in general makes things more accessible for everybody. So in terms of like inclusion for people with disabilities, having those bathrooms there on campus is really important. And to broaden that to trans inclusion, making sure that those bathrooms are gender neutral, whether it's like single room bathrooms that are unmarked, that are just general bathrooms, like you can just come in here and pee and it doesn't matter how you identify. Yeah, just making that, like, that's, I feel like that's such a simple step, just making sure that, especially for somebody like myself, as somebody who exists outside of the gender binary, not having to sacrifice my gender identity just to go to the bathroom, not having to make a choice about my identity or having to give that up just to go pee. I think is a really big step for trans inclusion that I think we're still working on everywhere, not just in the public garden space. And I know for Allen Centennial Garden, we're so tiny that we aren't even getting bathrooms still at all for a couple of years. So luckily, this has kind of all been happening while we've been having that sort of bathroom dialogue about how to include trans people and make trans people feel safe in public restrooms. So we were able to kind of implement that in the design of the bathrooms that we'll have on campus for that. One of the really big things I would like to see, especially given my experience at Allen Centennial Garden, is a lot more pronoun workshops and education on just the trans experience in general. I think I definitely experienced some, like I said, I experienced some microaggression and tokenization at my place of work, and being able to train staff and volunteers, because I think that's something we're missing right now, is there's definitely starting to be more diversity training for staff members. And that's fantastic. And we're really happy to see it, obviously. But I think broadening that education to people that are going to be working at your garden, if you're going to be welcoming in volunteers, you need to be making sure that those volunteers are also going to be respectful of your staff and other volunteers and the visitors that you're welcoming into your garden. So if you're going to be having volunteers, you need to make sure that they uphold those values and are being sensitive and accepting and understanding of the trans people that are coming into your garden on a daily basis. And I think too, this goes a long way to kind of avoid the tokenization of your trans staff members, because I know a lot of cisgender allies' intentions may be really good when interacting with us, but sometimes things fall short, and that's where that education comes in and kind of prevents that from happening. Because I know at my place of work, I was being introduced by one of my bosses at a project we were working on, and all of us were introduced, and I was the only one that was introduced with pronouns. So it was very embarrassing and uncomfortable for me to experience, going around and being introduced and saying, this is our staff member, this is our staff member, this is our staff member, who, by the way, is trans and uses they, them pronouns. It's as great as it is to have people informed of my pronouns, it's very isolating experience to have something like that happen. And it's definitely uncomfortable in the moment. And like I said, having that education can kind of help those situations be avoided. And I think one of the big ticket things about this education too is education on how to accept and how to accept correction when being corrected on somebody's pronouns, and how to correct other people on people's pronouns. I think that's something especially cisgender people are very unfamiliar with, which is okay. It's okay to be unfamiliar with something, but we want you to be open to learning about that, so we don't have to bear the emotional burden of constantly vouching for ourselves and constantly correcting other people on our pronouns, because that gets really exhausting. And sometimes it is tempting to just give up and be misgendered for the day, as hurtful as that is to hear. And like I said, just encouraging people to try their best and really emphasizing that, it is okay if you stumble and mess up every once in a while, as long as you're correcting yourself and apologizing and just quickly moving forward with the interaction and not making it a whole thing, because that's embarrassing as well. And on that front of trying and making that effort, really making the effort to not just memorize somebody's set of somebody's pronouns, but also working in your, like, internally to kind of deconstruct your idea of gender and how you think that person should be, and things like that. So when, for example, addressing me as a person and learning to use my pronouns of they, them, theirs, you know, not just seeing me as like a binary person who uses they, them pronouns, seeing me truly as somebody outside of the binary and learning what that means, and really getting it in your head that I am a non-binary person, I am a trans individual, and that's why these are my pronouns. Yeah, I think the education workshops and things like that just need to be more inclusive of all of those things, because I think right now, even if there are pronoun workshops in a lot of gardens, it's really just kind of the baseline bare minimum of like, here's how to use these pronouns, which is fantastic, but it's just not quite enough. It's really not doing the deconstructing and the unpacking that a lot of people need to be doing in order to really put that into practice, and you know, not need so much correcting from person to person, and you know, making sure your language as well is inclusive. And I know we touched on that earlier, but I think one of the big things that was kind of a hot phrase recently was preferred pronouns, and that's fine, but my pronouns aren't a preference. And I think I speak for a lot of trans people when we say, you know, my pronouns aren't a preference. It's not, well, I'd really like for you to use they, them pronouns, but if that's too hard, that's okay. These are my pronouns, and if you respect me, you'll use them. And educating people on what that means as well. And yeah, I think educating on how to ask for pronouns and things like that. I know I was asked recently on how to ask for people's pronouns, and I kind of said, you know, it's almost like missing somebody's name in an introduction. So, you know, hey, I never caught your name in the introductions. My name's Al. What's your name? So, hey, I never caught your pronouns during the introduction. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. What are your pronouns? And I think one of the other things too, kind of getting away from education, there's a lot to cover there. Also having like name flexibility on like pay stubs and schedules and things like that, I think is super important. I know for me, it's definitely very uncomfortable to have to see my birth name. I don't personally see it as a dead name because I'm non-binary and things of that nature are a little complicated for me. But for trans people to see their dead name on certain items is really uncomfortable, especially for scheduling, because that gives a lot of other staff members and people you may not want to see access to your dead name, access to a name that is not yours, and a name you don't feel any connection to, and a name that might have caused you a lot of trauma and stress in the past, and having to see that and be addressed by that, and having other people know that very intimate and hurtful information is really scary. You know, being able to be flexible on that and keeping that sort of information private, and allowing trans people to keep their dead names safe and things like that is really important as well. And on the topic of, you know, trans inclusion and higher up things, trans inclusivity and benefits as well is really, really important. So having insurance that covers hormone, like HRT, like hormone replacement therapy for trans people, and having paid time off for gender confirmation surgeries and things like that is also really important. But I would say for our cis allies in the audience, I think one of the biggest things I'd really love for you guys to take home is we really appreciate you wanting to take away the emotional burden from all of us. But I think the hallmark of a good ally, of a good cisgender ally to the trans community, is knowing when to step back and knowing when you don't have the qualifications to be talking about something because this is not your experience, and when to defer to trans people. So when being asked certain questions, saying, I can give you a general idea based on what I know as an outsider to the trans experience, but I would really encourage you to talk about this with a trans individual because this is just an experience I don't have access to and knowledge that I just don't have.
Fabulous. Well, thank you, Trey and Al, for sharing your experiences and letting us all learn as well what the specific changes are and the specific meaningful elements of inclusion. And I have nothing to add because of exactly what Al said. But at this point, we would love to open it up to our audience for questions. I know that some people have been throwing them in the chat in the Q&A. So our fabulous Bryan, I believe, is going to begin sharing those with us.
Yeah, so I've been kind of in the background here. Hi, everyone, I'm Bryan. I've been kind of in the background here filtering out some themes in the questions. I think Al really addressed, there were a few questions about like, how do you ask for someone's pronouns? And I think Al, you really spoke to that. Kind of maybe it's better to introduce yourself with your pronouns first, and to not assume someone's pronouns. But specifically, Al, I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit more about dead naming, because some cisgendered people may not be as familiar with the term or what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So for a lot of trans individuals, so Al is not the name I was assigned at birth. I do have a different name that's on my birth certificate, all of that. And I don't give people that name because it's a name I'm not comfortable with. It's a name that if addressed by, I almost certainly wouldn't respond to at this point. And for a lot of binary trans people, their dead name may be completely different than their chosen name. And, one of the big things is to be really sensitive about that. And if a trans person ever ends up kind of talking about, this is something that happens to me often. So if a trans person ends up talking about their dead name, just kind of offhand, don't ask for it. That's something we might have to embarrass you a little bit and say, I don't feel comfortable giving that to you. I don't give that information out to people. Please don't ask any other trans person for their dead name. It's a very embarrassing ordeal. Yeah, and like I said, a lot of trans people just don't feel any connection to their dead name, and often their dead name is something that's very triggering and very hurtful to hear. So yeah.
Great, thank you for kind of going into that a little bit more. I think people find that helpful. So we got a few questions here about intersectionality. And there's one here from Amalia that I'm going to bring up here. And let's see, Amalia had asked what resources and dialogues are available for BIPOC or Black and Indigenous people of color, trans folks with intersectional identities. And then there was another question that we got about the intersection of ableism and trans folks. And is anyone working on addressing those intersections? So if anyone wants to kind of speak to some of the intersectionality here.
Honestly, I think some of the best resources to learn about intersectionality in terms of trans inclusion, whether that's intersectionality in terms of disabled trans people or trans people of color or like Black or Indigenous trans people, I think your best bet is going to be turning to those groups of people. I, as an able-bodied white trans person, do not have the authority or the experience to talk on their experiences. I think that would be a very ignorant thing for me to do. So, I can't think of any resources offhand. At the moment, I can try to think of some while other people are talking, but, seeking out resources written by trans women of color or by disabled trans people, things like that.
Yeah, Trey, I wanted to ask then, because you have that, your research that you did, do you have things in there that people can look to? Because I know we have your paper uploaded on the APGA resources, and maybe you can tell us exactly where people can find that. And then do you have things in there that address this intersectionality?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have too many specific resources on intersectionality. I do think that it's best to go to the folks who have lived that experiences and to organizations devoted to, helping and that are run by, trans people of color. One of the organizations that I am a big fan of is the Audre Lorde Project, ALP.org. In New York City, which focuses on supporting LGBTQ people of color. Yeah, so really looking at just those sorts of organizations.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
One of the things I put in the chat just now is something that I thought was a really great article. If you want to learn, at least like kind of dip your toes into the intersectionality of trans identities, is My Gender is Black by Ari Ziad. I thought it was a really informative article. I would highly recommend reading it. Like I said, I put it in the chat if anybody's interested in reading that in the future.
I'll also say, so Ali did in the chat share my toolkit. So you have it there if anyone would like to take a look at that.
Okay, great, thank you. So then we did get a question here. Sorry, one second. I think this was specifically for Trey. From your research, did you come across related types of organizations, museums, nature-based education sites, etc., that are doing a particularly good job of trans inclusion? And I think you had mentioned Denver Botanic as one of those.
Yeah, so Denver Botanic Gardens has been doing great idea work broadly, and have been more recently getting more involved with LGBTQ inclusion. But some of the, so there were a couple of gardens that have been doing a lot of good work on their own. Queens Botanical Garden has in the last few years really been educating themselves and broadening their diversity and inclusion initiatives to include LGBTQ inclusion and trans inclusion specifically. And then Vizcaya Museum and Gardens in Florida has been doing a lot of really important work on LGBTQ and again, trans inclusion. And then looking at, beyond gardens at the broader museum field, I didn't look at too many specific museums, but I did look towards the American Alliance of Museums, and they've been doing some really great work. They have an LGBTQ+ alliance that has been doing work for the broader museum field, and within that they have a transgender task force. And so they've put together guides for transition for museums, for employees at museums who want to transition, for their coworkers, and for leadership and HR. And then also just the broader LGBTQ alliances work on standards for museums and applying LGBTQ inclusion to those. And you can find these on the American Alliance Museum's website. And I also include them and a description of why they're useful in my toolkit.
Great, thank you. So I think, let's see, there's a question here that I'm not sure we touched on. If you've let's see here. If you've visited other arboreta or botanic gardens, what facets of the visits led you to feel welcome or to feel unwelcome? So if any of you want to speak to that.
Generally, as a queer person, I think the way in which they describe their visitors or their visitors are marketed can be huge. Even just things like assuming, you know, like I work in the development space, so that a membership are parents and biological children. That is already assuming that you think of a family as described in a certain way. So I think that that can be really big, is really analyzing every single facet of your program and how are you describing a caregiver-child relationship? Are you having lots of pictures of a very visibly male and female person? Are there people who are, you know, visibly queer in one way or another in your marketing? I think that that can really go above and beyond to show that you're being intentional. Now, it's not about like the tokenism of of doing a call out and hiring, but finding who are the people who are already part of your staff, already part of your membership, who are willing to share their story. I think that those kinds of things can be really important. And I think that visual representation can also span so many things, even when you think about what does your wedding website look like? You know, I think a lot of us have a lot of income from weddings, but I have noticed a huge evolution in the past 5 years of the amount of people of color and of queer couples getting married here, because we've made an intention to your form say partner's name. We're never assuming that the who is the other person who's going to be walking into a meeting, that what your names are mean a certain thing. I think that just really analyzing everything through a gendered lens or an ungendered lens and an unheterosexual lens can really do great ways to say, okay, you weren't assuming anything about me when I walked into the room, can really be huge.
Yeah, to speak on that too, one of the things that I visited a very big botanic garden recently to kind of learn about public horticulture on a much larger scale. And you can definitely, as a trans person, I can absolutely tell where the education has been done and where it hasn't, just by interacting with staff. And as I interacted with the staff at this garden, I was being constantly misgendered. And yeah, obviously, that's a garden I have crossed off my list as far as working at in the future, just because I didn't feel welcome right off the bat, because I was wearing something with my pronouns on it. I introduced myself with my pronouns. And as we walked around, I was getting misgendered by every single person we encountered. And at the very end, I was getting career advice from one of the horticulturists, and it was suggested I join a group for women in horticulture, which was just kind of the final blow. And I was like, wow, I am so uncomfortable here. I'm glad this tour is over. Obviously, I will not be disclosing the name of that garden for obvious reasons. But yeah, I think one of the biggest ways I feel unwelcome when attending a garden is interacting with staff and very clearly seeing that there has been no education on this front. Because like I said, I think to a trans person, it's obvious who has never seen a trans person before and does not know how to interact with trans people and does not know how to be respectful of trans people and our pronouns and things like that. And I think that's the biggest way to ruin a garden experience for a trans person, whether they're a visitor or a staff member or a potential hire or a volunteer or anything like that. Yeah, you really need to educate your staff.
So before I answer, I do want to say, sorry, we're a little bit over time, but I know and I think the other panelists are happy to continue answering a few more questions. And also that, as Bailee said, that this is being recorded and will be available soon on the website. And I want to echo what Al and Allie said in response to that question, in particular, to feel welcome by seeing, myself and my identities represented, whether that's in person at the garden, for example, seeing a pride flag in June or beyond that, seeing people share their pronouns, and seeing people who look like me, and seeing a diversity of people. And this also goes back to it not all being white folks, it not all being cisgender queer folks for your LGBTQ inclusion. And then also, as Al was saying, feeling welcome when I get there by having a good experience and having culturally competent interactions, having people who don't misgender me, who can help answer my questions, or direct me to what I'm looking for in an appropriate way. And so, yeah, the seeing myself and feeling welcomed when I am there.
Great, thank you. So there's two questions here that I kind of want to take together. And this first one, I think you all addressed a little bit at least, and that is, what types of training do your gardens offer to employees, to volunteers on LGBTQ+ inclusion? How are the trainings similar and different? And I think, like Al talked about how they've been doing some work with Centennial, kind of like starting that process. And then Allie has been doing that already for a few years now. And then the follow-up that I also maybe want to have a little bit more of a discussion about: how would you suggest public gardens best educate members on LGBTQ inclusion without putting the emotional labor on LGBTQ staff and others? And so I just want to start off by saying, the previous garden that I worked at did not have any type of training for any type of inclusion, let alone queer inclusion. And I mean, you could tell when my husband and I booked our wedding venue at the garden, on the form, it had like bride and groom, kind of like what Allie was talking about earlier. And so, yeah, that kind of forced me to go out of my way to be like, hey, maybe we want to look at changing this. And I think there's a fine balance there between like asking queer people to do all of the work, but then you also don't want that work being led by cisgendered straight people who haven't had those experiences. So I'll kind of open that up.
So for me, as I mentioned, someone had reached out to me about putting together a language-focused workshop, which has evolved into language workshop and diving into elements of gender and sexual orientation and queer identities more general. But as Al mentioned, it doesn't go into, it grazes the surface, but doesn't really start having that next level of really thoughtful discussion, really thoughtful unpacking. And I think one thing that actually is really important is that you are provided sort of the LGBTQ inclusion 101, which I provide. And if anybody's interested in learning more about it, please send me an email. I would love to chat, but also making sure when you do that second level, that it is a safe space, because actually just today I had a non-binary friend saying about how triggered they were because it was very clear that the training was made for cisgender people, and that the kinds of questions that were being asked of them when they were in a mixed gendered group were really triggering for them. And so I think it's really important for us to have very safe spaces for us to unpack gender, but making sure that we're not assuming that these trainings are assuming that everybody in the room is cis or that everybody in the room is straight. And I think that that can be a delicate balance. And I think that we're still always thinking about that. So I just wanted to bring that up because I think that next level is incredibly important. And it's something that the few times I've done the LGBTQ 101 training, I always feel that something's missing. I don't think that people are fully understanding my experience and my friends and colleagues' experience. And I think it's important that we have that next level. So in terms of like what's available out there, I do think it's important that you're looking for who created the training and how the training was created. I pride myself on the training I've created because I made sure that I think a dozen people of a variety of experiences and orientations and genders looked it over and said, this feels right and this doesn't. And so when you're going out and finding trainers, that you're doing that. And also when you're finding trainers, to Bryan's point about how do you balance having a trans voice at the table or a queer voice at the table versus putting that emotional burden on them, is opening it up. We are going to be doing this. Who wants to be on the task force? Who wants to view the resumes and things like that? And allowing people to bring themselves to the table, I think is one way that I've felt included, because there have been some times it says, well, this is a queer thing, so Allie, go do it. And sometimes I'm willing to do it, and sometimes it's completely not something I'm comfortable doing. So always, I guess, having a chair at the table opening and inviting people to sit in is important from my point of view.
Al or Trey, did you have anything to add to that? Or okay. So let's see here. There's one that I wanted to get to here. I think this was a follow-up to what Trey was talking about with some of the research. And it is, are there any great examples of organizations who do a great job with gender inclusion among children groups specifically? I'm thinking it's so easy to do the boys versus girls things when kids groups get together for garden programs. Any knowledge of how this is being addressed? So maybe something a little more oriented towards children. If there are any resources, sorry.
I don't have anything off the top of my head, but an organization that I think has done a lot of really good work is PFLAG. And so they're focused on families of LGBTQ folks. So I'm not certain if they have things directed at children, but if anyone does, then I would think they might. And I'll share in chat the link to PFLAG's website.
I actually, oh, sorry, go ahead, Al.
Oh, sorry. So I guess I had a couple of children's groups visit Allen Centennial Garden while we were here. And I guess the one thing I want to say is, like, I think children are a lot smarter than people give them credit for. You know, I feel like talking about trans identities in terms of pronouns and things like that, and saying like things like, you know, like, hey, you know, like some people don't feel like a boy or a girl, and some people are born and told they're boys but are actually girls, and some people are born and told they're girls and they're actually boys. And I find that children catch on to things like that pretty quickly because they haven't done a lot of that learning different prejudices and biases and things like that. So just doing it in gentle ways it's surprisingly easy. Yeah, and I think to address the like boys versus girls groups in this question too, it's pretty easy to just like round up a huge group of kids and be like, you this way, your group, you in the middle, your group, and this section, your group. It's just, you know, a lot of people have been separating kids by gender for so long that they don't think of these really easy solutions.
I think one thing to your point about kids being smarter than they are is also language and inclusivity in the queer space, generally speaking, is moving so fast. I mean, even though the three of us, you probably would like maybe throw in the same generation. If you were to break it down into queer generations, we are 3 separate queer generations, 4 separate queer generations with Bryan on the call, because progress has been made so fast that our experiences is widely different. So I think younger kids are being encouraged to explore gender, think about gender in different ways. I even wonder if the whole boys versus girls thing probably isn't even a thing that's happening. This came up actually in my LGBTQ inclusion training, and a colleague who has a gender nonconforming child came up to me and encouraged me to think about a few things. If a kid is presenting in a gender nonconforming way, they probably have parental support at home. And that's important to remember, because I can go out and buy whatever clothes I want, but a kid who's dressing in some sort of gender nonconforming way or opposite of perception way, they have parental support at home. And that means that kid has also probably had conversations about what gender is, what their gender is, how they experience it maybe differently than their classmates. So the question was specifically brought up, what if there's a gender nonconforming child and another kid says, hey, are you a boy or a girl? If you're the program manager, do you intervene? And it was encouraged to me, again, this is one parent of one gender nonconforming child, but the parent said, take note of it and see how the kid responds, because that's allowing the kid to have their own independence, to stand up for themselves, to explain their gender in the way that they understand their gender. And they probably do have support at home that have practiced a script. And over time, that script will become just more of an actual conversation. But if it's a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old, it's probably a script. So that was something that was really encouraging to remember. And so I think if it's simultaneously, we remember that kids are smarter, that language and experiences are changing, and that these kids probably have support at home, what can we then do as adults? So we can not do boys versus girls. We can not have gender on the form, or have an inclusive way of just saying gender blank, answer the question. Do you have a section that just says, are there other things I should know about your child? And that's opening the opportunity for it to be, they've got peanut allergies, they go by this name sometimes, you can have a million things. You don't have to say, is your kid trans? Like, that's not the question. What are there other things I should know if your kid's going to enter into this program? And a parent is going to say, this is the thing you need to know. They're exploring their gender identity, or they're very comfortable with their gender identity, or can you make sure you use this name, or whatever it is. I think it's a lot about, again, us as adults, or as cisgender adults, thinking about how we can break down our norms, our stereotypes, our assumptions, and encouraging those inclusive spaces for kids.
Great, thank you. Are you all down to answer a few more questions? I know we're over time, but I know I'm happy to keep going if you are.
I unfortunately have to jet, but I will see you later. Thank you all, panelists and audience.
Yeah, I think it'd be a good time to wrap it up.
Sounds good. Trey, did you want to give us a send-off?
Yeah, so thank you everyone so much for coming. And thank you to our panelists, Ali, who has already hopped off. And so Bailee shared in chat, again, my toolkit, as well as the idea discussion forum on the American Public Gardens Association's website. Members can log in to, ask questions and have conversations about idea topics, just like, and you can, be part of other communities within the association. If you do have further questions, I encourage you to ask them on that discussion forum. So thank you so much, everyone.